Humanity wasn't conquered. It wasn't destroyed. It was measured. Beings from beyond reality weren't seeking enemies. They were seeking an answer and asked a question that couldn't be ignored. Are you still human? Those who dared to face the mirror saw not a threat, but a path. Not weapons, but memory. Not war, but resonance. Not survival, but awakening. And when the universe heard that humanity was ready, it didn't become an exception. It became an invitation. Stay with us if you want to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe. The world of Targinius 4 had once been the crown jewel of the outer colonies, a shining beacon of stability on the frontier. Wrapped in green and blue, its three oceans shimmered beneath artificial satellites that controlled rainfall down to the centimeter. Vast plains of cultivated algae fields and heavy metal harvesters stretched to the horizons. Its cities were self-contained ecosystems, floating seamlessly above the surface or embedded deep in armored cliffs. The Terran Accord had poured everything into its growth, seeing in it the promise of human endurance far from soul. And then the sky split open. No warning. No declaration. One moment, the orbital net pulsed as usual, monitoring trade traffic and meteor paths. The next, an anomaly spread like a bloom of ink across the upper thermosphere, black, pulsating, utterly silent. From that rift emerged vessels that did not resemble anything in the Accord's databases. No drive signatures. No comms. No markings. Just black holes and impossible geometry, shifting subtly as though half of them existed out of phase with reality itself. Within 93 seconds of their appearance, the orbital defense platforms were gone, sliced apart by beams of light that left no thermal signature, only holes in mass. The main city, Haven's Reach, lost contact a moment later. No impact crater. No fire. Just absence. Where once a metropolis floated above a canyon lake, now there was a shimmering void and the smell of ozone. Command relays failed. Emergency AI cores began spinning paradox errors, unable to reconcile cause and effect in their data streams. On the ground, survivors didn't speak of explosions or fire. They spoke of pressure, a weight inside their minds, like being watched by something that didn't need to see them with eyes. Soldiers described feeling old memories bubbling up from nowhere. Some forgot their own names. Some fell to their knees and began screaming prayers in ancient earth tongues they'd never studied. And above them, the sky pulsed once more. The evacuation protocols were instantaneous. Terran High Command, receiving fragmented bursts from the edge of Targinius space, dispatched a retrieval fleet in under 4 minutes. They called it Hostile Phenomenon Class Null. That classification had only ever been theoretical, a contingency for contact scenarios outside all known threat frameworks. The fleet arrived 13 hours later and found a world still burning beneath the surface of reality. The anomaly was gone, but the damage wasn't. Targinius IV's biosphere was intact. Oceans still rolled. Wind patterns still whispered across the plains. But something fundamental had changed. The world was dimmed. Colors seemed thinner. Light didn't behave correctly. Photons refracted in patterns that disagreed with quantum prediction models. Most disturbingly, the humans who had survived, only about 12,000 across multiple scattered colonies, were no longer recognizable in scans. Their biometric signatures were twisted, fluctuating. Neural patterns fluctuated with background radiation. And all of them had gone completely silent. Not dead. Not violent. Just silent. Eyes open. Staring upward. As if still listening to the thing that had come and left. The Accord sealed Targinius 4 behind a Class 4 quarantine ring. Official reports listed the world as lost to an uncontained gravimetric event. No one believed it. Across the inner colonies, stories spread. Of Terran fleets warping to the edge of known space and never returning. Of communications relays picking up coded messages in languages no human or alien linguist could translate. And always, the phrase returned again and again. They were not here to conquer. They were here to measure. To the outside galaxy, it seemed that something had tested humanity and found them incomplete. High Marshal Aline Kor knew something had gone wrong the moment she opened the debrief packet on her private deck aboard the TSS Remembrance. The classified file bore the highest clearance stamp, Delta Mark, existential priority. She read it in silence. Then read it again. Targinius had not simply been attacked. It had been examined. The foreign vessels had mapped neural feedback across the planetary grid. They'd left quantum markers, seeds buried in time loops, designed to react only when human memory reached a specific threshold. It wasn't a weapon. It was a question. And Kor knew something that the rest of the galaxy did not. This wasn't the first time it had been asked. 57 years ago, in a remote sector beyond the Perseus Rift, a Terran scout ship called the Asterian had picked up an anomalous reading. 17 crew. 6 seconds of contact. 1 survivor. The official record had been buried, and the survivor institutionalized. Kor had read his final statement. 6 words, scratched into the wall of his containment room with his fingernails. We are not what they seek. Now, the pattern was clear. The enemy, or whatever it was, wasn't invading. It wasn't conquering. It wasn't even truly communicating. It was testing, measuring humanity's state of evolution, its cohesion, its resonance. And every time they came, more Terrans were changed. Not visibly, Not physically, but something inside them had shifted. Dreams changed. Memory loops increased. Certain frequencies in Terran speech began to harmonize in ways no one could explain. Civilians began reporting shared visions of a structure suspended in a black sea, of a voice that whispered not in words, but in certainty. Kor wasn't just a soldier. She was a survivor of the Ellerin collapse, the only commander to repel a 3-vector assault from the Caldari hive. And she was afraid. Because deep in her gut, she knew what this was. It wasn't first contact. It was final judgment. And humanity was being weighed. The TSS Remembrance moved through the void with the quiet authority of a ship that had survived 100 battles and forgotten none of them. Its hull was layered with advanced stealth alloys, invisible to most detection grids. But Aline Kor knew that whatever had examined Targenius 4 would see through that in a heartbeat. It wasn't looking for heat signatures or energy spikes. It was looking for who they were. She stood at the forward viewing deck, arms crossed behind her back, watching the starfield warp around them as they dropped into a cold transit drift. The Remembrance wasn't heading for war, it was heading for a signal. Specifically, a human signal. 7 days after the incident at Targenius, one of the most distant Terran colonies, Ellery Prime, sent an unauthorized long-range transmission. The message was encrypted using an ancient accord frequency no longer in use since the Treaty of Verdanis. The source of the code? A Terran citizen who died over 100 years ago. Except the biometric stamp on the transmission matched perfectly. And the message was clear. It's not over. They are still here. We can still be corrected. That word corrected sent shivers through the entire command chain. Not attacked. Not saved. Corrected. As if humanity were a variable in some greater equation, and something, had returned to make adjustments. The Remembrance was the first Terran ship to enter Ellery space since the transmission. No contact had been made since. The colony's automated systems responded normally, but no human voice answered. Until now. As the ship reached orbit, a single voice echoed through the comms. Soft, human, and identical to the voice of the long-dead transmitter. Welcome back. We've been waiting. They landed near the main colony hub. It was structurally intact, no signs of battle, no environmental damage. Perfectly preserved. But it was empty. No bodies. No civilians. Not even footprints in the dust. As if the entire population had simply stepped away seconds before their arrival. Kor walked through the central plaza, flanked by elite recon division operators. Their HUD showed movement. But there was nothing. Then she saw the mural. A great arch etched into the colony's wall. Painted in fine brush strokes. Human hands had made this, not AI. It was beautiful. And it showed a gate. Not metaphorical. Literal. Black, smooth, circular. Suspended in space. And from that gate, figures were emerging. Human silhouettes. But wrong. Elongated. Featureless. Faceless. And they were reaching towards something. A sun? No. A mirror. One of her lieutenants cursed softly. Ma'am, you need to see this. They followed him through the access corridor into the old colony's archival chamber. The data core was still active, but instead of Terran logs, it was full of something else. Footage. Hundreds of hours of surveillance showing colonists walking, working, smiling. Until the last few days. In the final recordings, they all began doing the same thing. Standing still. Looking at the sky. Whispering in sync. No panic. No fear. Just surrender. And then, in the final clip, every person in the colony turned at the same moment and said in perfect unison, "We are not what you seek, but we will try to be," and walked into the ocean. They searched the waters. Found no trace. No bodies. No currents disturbed. No footprints leading in. Just stillness. Like the sea had accepted them. Kor ordered full lockdown. But she didn't transmit back to command. Not yet. Because something told her they were no longer alone. And that night, her dreams bled. She stood in a place she had never seen. A black corridor lit by stars that didn't belong in any known catalog. The air was thick with presence. She wasn't alone, but she wasn't being threatened. She was being studied. An indistinct shape floated ahead, pulsing with shifting geometries. Not a creature. Not a ship. A question made flesh. And in her dream, it spoke, not in words, but in realization. We are not enemies. We are not saviors. We are not gods. We are the mirror. And your kind is beginning to cast a shadow. She woke screaming. Back aboard the Remembrance, her team found her already dressed and issuing orders. Pull everyone back, she commanded. Ellery is not a colony anymore. It's a message. But to who? Rice asked. She stared out the viewport. To us. They launched the data buoy containing all findings and ignited the colony's core. Not to destroy the truth, but to deny access to those who weren't ready to see it. Because now, Kor was certain of one thing. The enemy hadn't come to take humanity. It had come to reflect it. And each world they visited, each soul they touched, each colony they tested, they weren't destroying. They were showing. Showing what humanity was becoming. Or perhaps, what it was meant to be. And somewhere, far beyond the edge of any charted space, the mirror blinked. Not with malice. Not with pity. But with decision. The next test was coming. And it would not be subtle. They called it the Whisper Array, a secret listening post suspended in the gravitational halo between three dead stars, far beyond Accord space. Officially, it didn't exist. Built from stealth composites and surrounded by phase-scattered sensor fields, it was the most classified observation station the Terran Accord had ever constructed. It was never meant to be found. It wasn't even meant to listen to the galaxy. It was built to listen for them. After the Targinius incident and the silence of Ellery Prime, Command reactivated the Whisper Array's full protocols. 200 operators were assigned to its decks, each trained to recognize nonlinear signal patterns, memory field entanglements, and synthetic linguistic bleed. And still, it wasn't enough. The signal didn't arrive. It manifested, not through antennas, but inside the minds of the crew. It began as déjà vu small things. Remembering conversations that hadn't happened, hearing snippets of songs that didn't exist, then dreams synchronized across personnel. Identical symbols etched in sleep journals. Phrases scrawled in mirror fog with no condensation present. The operators didn't panic. They documented. Until the day the stars blinked. On that day, all three stars dimmed simultaneously, just for a moment, and just to those aboard the array. The external logs recorded nothing, but everyone inside saw it, felt it. And then, one word echoed across the minds of every living being inside. Proximity. Not a warning. A statement. The following minute, one of the crew members, a veteran analyst named Juno Aves, walked into the central AI core, looked directly into the retinal scanner, and calmly said, "They have made a decision. It begins now." She then collapsed. Her vitals flatlined. But her mind didn't. Neurological readings spiked into the impossible. Her brain emitted pulses in 12 frequencies, some of which didn't exist on any electromagnetic spectrum. The onboard AI tried to isolate her activity. It failed, and then crashed. Permanently. The Whisper Array had fallen silent. But before its last automated process terminated, it triggered a final burst transmission. 3 coordinates. 3 planets. 3 targets. Marked only with one label. Pending review. High Marshal Aline Kaur received the data packet aboard the Remembrance 6 hours later. She recognized the coordinates. She knew them. She had been born on one. Her voice was steady as she gave the order. Recall all active operatives. Redirect blackside assets. Every fleet not defending a core world is now reclassified under Directive Solstice. Her second-in-command swallowed hard. "You think this is an attack?" Kaur looked him dead in the eyes. "No. This is the exam." They deployed Terran vessels in staggered formations, one task force to each world, backed by full Spectre-class observation cruisers. The fleet didn't land. They watched. And what they saw changed everything. On Varen's Hollow, a quiet mining colony, citizens were already preparing. They had built towers in strange shapes that didn't appear on their planning documents. They didn't recall building them. Their children began speaking in harmonic phrases, mimicking waveforms that perfectly matched the Whisper Array's last readings. On Umia, a research outpost, the entire facility had turned inward. Not spiritually, literally. Every room, every corridor, every lab had reoriented to face the central chamber. No one remembered initiating the reconstruction, but in that chamber sat a sphere. Metallic. Perfect. Not built by them. Still warm. On Calyx Theta, nothing had changed. No anomalies. No dreams. No signs. Until the dead started speaking. Buried neural implants of deceased colonists activated, broadcasting ancient fragments of voice recordings in unison. Not a glitch. Not a malfunction. A reply. "We see you trying. You are almost ready. But not all of you. That must be corrected." Back on the Remembrance, Kaur called an emergency session of the Inner Command Council. Not with pleasantries. Not with diplomatic protocol. "We are being shaped," she said. "Molded." One admiral scoffed. "You're suggesting these beings, if that's even what they are trying to guide us?" "No," Kaur said. "They're trying to see if we can guide ourselves. And if we can't?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because deep in the intelligence logs, deep in the first fragments of what had come from the Whisper Array, there was something more. Not a threat. Not a prediction. A test key. And it showed 2 outcomes. One led to humanity standing in harmony with something greater than themselves, ascending, yes, but retaining identity. The other? Erasure. Not as punishment, but as course correction. That night, every Terran AI went offline for exactly 3.3 seconds. When they rebooted, each one displayed the same sentence. "You will not be warned again." It began with silence. Not absence of sound, but a deliberate, heavy pause. Across Terran-controlled space, sensor stations reported null space fluctuations with no corresponding mass shifts. Communications relays began picking up echoes of transmissions that had never been sent. The echoes weren't copies. They were rehearsals. Practice runs. As if something was learning the shape of Terran language. The rhythm of their memory. The texture of their thoughts. Then came the dreams. They struck across colonies, stations, even deep space vessels running non-neural crews. Some dismissed them as mass hysteria. Others as a delayed side effect of exposure to the Whisper Array signals. But the patterns didn't match hysteria. They matched testing protocols. And in each dream, the same vision appeared, a staircase made of glass, spiraling upward into a sky with no stars. At the top stood a gate, not open, not closed, but watching. And just before waking, the dreamer would hear a single sentence, always in their own voice. You must decide what you are. The Accord Council fractured. Some believed the time had come for confrontation, that this hidden force, whatever it was, had gone too far. Humanity must assert control, show power, push back. Others argued for silence, for submission, if necessary, for the preservation of the species, even if it meant becoming something else. Only High Marshal Kor stood without allegiance. She didn't argue. She listened. To her crew. To the transmissions. And, increasingly, to the voice in her own head. It wasn't madness. It wasn't alien. It was memory coming back in pieces. Fragments of a war no one remembered. Because they hadn't fought it with weapons. They had fought it with identity. And they had lost. On Calyx Theta, the phenomenon escalated. Terran teams deployed groundside to investigate the awakening implants now reported disappearing. Not deactivating, phasing out. As if plucked from the timeline entirely. Footage showed them vanishing frame by frame, their presence being rewritten. More disturbing, the colonists were no longer speaking to Terran command. They were speaking to something else. Their sentences no longer began with I. They began with we. A new pronoun began appearing in their speech. Not they, not us, but something between. Thone. No linguistic root. No etymology. It simply was, and it described the entity they were now in communion with. Not worshipping. Harmonizing. Kor demanded contact. She stood alone on the surface of Calyx Theta. No helmet, no armor, her skin raw under the red glare of the planet's twin suns. Who are you? She said aloud, voice steady. What do you want from us? And the air shifted. Not with movement. With context. She felt the weight of observation settle upon her like a second atmosphere. Something hurt her. Not out there. Inside. Then, a voice not external, but in perfect harmony with her own thoughts, replied. We are what remains when potential collapses. We do not want. We measure. You are approaching resonance. But still fragmented. You must unify. Or be recycled. She sank to her knees. Not from fear. From understanding. This wasn't judgment. It was optimization. In orbit, the remembrance registered a temporal spike. A vessel appeared. No warning. No warp signature. Just there. It wasn't built. It wasn't flying. It was existing, imposed upon space like a correction in a sentence. Its hull shimmered in colors the eye couldn't track. Its angles bent away from perception. Every scan failed before it began. The crew dubbed it the mirror. It didn't broadcast. It didn't move. It simply hovered above Calyx Theta, pointed directly at Earth's vector. Waiting. Terran science vessels scrambled to analyze its behavior. A task force was dispatched to establish a dialogue. But when the ships got close, they disappeared. Not destroyed. Removed. The fleet wasn't attacked. It was deemed irrelevant. And yet, one transmission made it out. From the last ship, TSS Beacon, moments before contact loss. It's not a ship. It's a trigger. And we just told it we're not ready. Earth went dark. Not physically. Existentially. Every AI simultaneously shut down. All at once. No warning. No crash. Just stillness. And then every screen, everywhere, across every human system, from the core worlds to the outer rim, displayed one thing. A single question. Are you still human? It wasn't rhetorical. It was binary. Yes or no. There was no way to respond. And yet, the question waited. It hung in power grids. In neural links. In the silence between thoughts. Across the Terran networks, people felt it. In their bones. In their blood. The pressure to choose. Because the mirror wasn't going to ask again. It didn't want defiance. It didn't want submission. It wanted a signal. One that said, we know what we are. And across humanity, something began to stir. Not panic. Not unity. Something older. Something buried. A memory. Of who they had once almost become. And in a deep vault on Earth, sealed since the founding of the Accord, a light flickered. Not from power. From presence. A black monolith, untouched for centuries, vibrated against its restraints. Its surface shimmered, and a phrase long forgotten etched itself across its face. The test has returned. This time choose. The monolith spoke without words, yet its meaning flooded every channel of the Terran Accord's buried memory. Those who had access to the oldest vaults, biometric sealed, myth-wrapped black sites layered beneath ancient mountain ranges and sea trenches, understood immediately. This was the threshold. The test that had once come and gone, long before recorded history. The test that had defined not just survival, but significance. Humanity had faced this mirror once before. In its early expansion, before the Accord, before the Soul Wars, before even FTL. When Earth had been fractured and reaching, clawing its way into space like a blind animal desperate to matter. And whatever had watched them back then, had deemed them not ready. Not destroyed. Not uplifted. Simply interrupted. Their history had been allowed to proceed, but redirected. Slowed. Channeled. Memories wiped. Evidence buried in the DNA of stories, myths of watchers, angels, demons, fate. And now, with the advent of the Whisper Array's resonance match, the forgotten thread had looped back. The test had resumed. Aline Core stood in front of the monolith, deep beneath Accord Command in the Solaris core. It was larger than she remembered, but she had never actually seen it before. And yet she had. Her neural implant pulsed softly, vibrating in perfect sync with the stone's hum. The engineers, scientists, generals, all stood back, helpless. Their instruments were dead, their models useless. The monolith didn't interact with technology. It interacted with choice. And it was speaking to her, not with language, but with alignment. Because it was now clear, the mirror above Calyx Theta was not an alien machine. It was the lens. The monolith was the key, and humanity was the code. All across the Terran sphere, people began changing. Not visibly, but internally. There were awakenings, buried memories, strange epiphanies, a sense of dissonance falling into harmony. People spoke of feeling centered, as if something had clicked into place. Neural readings across medical networks spiked. Dream patterns synchronized across worlds. Infants were born humming frequencies that hadn't existed before. Earth's moon began emitting low-band pulses. The oceans shifted salinity by fractions, but in perfectly repeating Fibonacci intervals. Something was rewriting what it meant to be human. Not from outside, from within. The test wasn't looking for strength. It was looking for coherence. But not all of humanity responded the same. Resistance grew. Pockets of the population, militant, fearful, deeply embedded in archaic ideologies, began rejecting the shift. Their minds fractured. Some experienced psychotic breaks, unable to handle the new resonance patterns forming in the Terran psyche. Others simply vanished, like thoughts that no longer fit in the collective stream. Across the galaxy, these resistances collapsed in on themselves, burning brightly, then flickering out. The mirror didn't fight them. It simply excluded them. Meanwhile, something else was happening aboard the TSS Remembrance. In orbit above the mirror, Core's flagship had entered a state of deep harmonic sync with the construct. The ship's walls began changing, molecular patterns aligning with the resonance field projected from the surface of Calyx Theta. It was becoming alive. Or perhaps, it always had been. Deep within its AI core, an older system activated, one predating the ship's known schematics. A failsafe built during the original war, before memory of it was erased. Project Anamnesis. And it began playing a message one never heard by human ears. A voice older than language. You once reached beyond your grasp and touched the infinite. You bled for it. You broke for it. And we gave you the only mercy we could, to forget. Now, you remember. Now, you must choose again. To ascend and risk destruction, or to stay and be left behind. There will be no third offer. The mirror pulsed. A single ship detached from its underside. Not grown. Not launched. It simply was. A perfect vessel of unknown material. No seams. No engines. A door opened on its side. And one Terran soul was called. Not chosen. Called. Kerr stepped forward. The remembrance confirmed her presence and opened a corridor to escort her across the void. No one stopped her. No one could. Because it wasn't a command. It was alignment. And she belonged there. She entered the vessel. And it sealed. Inside, she found nothing. No walls. No light. No time. Only self. And then, across her mind, across the vast inner silence, a presence unfolded like a blossom of thought made of stars. Not alien. Not divine. Simply true. And it asked her one question. What are you willing to become? She didn't answer with words. She answered with understanding. And the mirror accepted. The stars outside flared. The ship vanished not in motion, but in resolution, folded into the lattice of decision. And in that moment, across the entire Terran sphere, something clicked. A pulse. A thought. A choice. And humanity, as one, answered. We are ready. The universe paused. Not literally, but in a way no one could quite describe, like the moment before the first breath of a newborn, or the silence between heartbeats when two souls first connect. In that instant, across 1,000 Terran systems, every active quantum relay went dark, then pulsed with a unified resonance signature. It wasn't data. It wasn't energy. It was decision. And the mirror responded, not with beams or signals or warships, but with presence. Every human, regardless of distance, class, mind type, or planetary alignment, felt it. A ripple of awareness. A soft pressure. A call not to kneel, but to stand. As if something vast and timeless had taken a breath and now waited to see if the children at once silenced were ready to speak again. And they were. On the edge of the Orion Veil, in a research station once abandoned during the first colony wars, something buried beneath the crust ignited. A dormant structure, older than humanity's expansion, older than Earth's oldest ruins, rose from the soil like a memory breaking through denial. It was octagonal, fractalized, and impossible. Its surface shimmered not with reflection, but with meaning and interface not of touch, but of intent. And when it activated, the stars around the station aligned. not astronomically. Narratively, every Terran vessel within 12 parsecs received a single symbol on their interface, one not in any known language, yet instantly understood. A glyph of humanity's becoming. In the Accord's central memory vaults, hidden in the lunar archive beneath Mare Crisium, something ancient began to write. Not by hand, not by code, but through reconciliation. Files once redacted for national security reappeared unaltered. Historical footage once considered conspiracy became context. Myths encoded in cultural memory now played in full high definition, complete with sensory overlays. It was as if reality itself had decided to stop lying. And in that cascade of returning truth, one pattern repeated again and again. You were once more. You forgot to protect yourselves from forgetting. Now, you must decide if memory is worth the burden. Inside the vessel that had taken her, High Marshal Aline Kor floated in a space without borders. It didn't feel like a ship. It felt like the inside of a decision. She saw herself from 1,000 angles, young, old, dying, newborn. She saw the wars she'd fought and the ones she hadn't. She saw Earth when it was still naive, Mars before it turned red, and colonies that had never been built. Time folded, not into loops, but into potential. And the voice, always there, never loud, spoke again. You cannot ascend as one unless you understand what one means. You warred for identity. You bled for sovereignty. You fractured for fear. But now the echo asks, what if you remembered together? And then it showed her. Every Terran war, every colonist death, every moment of cruelty and failure, each atrocity, betrayal, ambition, played out in silence. Then overlaid with what could have been. Not utopias, not fantasies, just better choices. Moments where mercy won instead of wrath. Where compassion rose instead of strategy. Where fear didn't control the vote. Where unity wasn't the slogan, it was the outcome. Kor trembled. Not from guilt, from awe. Because she finally understood. The test wasn't about power. It was about clarity. The mirror wasn't a threat. It was a gate. And it didn't open for conquerors. It opened for the coherent. On Earth, children born in the last 3 years began to hum again. Their tones matched the signals once recorded at the Whisper Array. Only now, they were complete. A language had formed. Not of words. Of agreements. Across the Accord, humanity began to act differently. Decisions became collective. Governments shifted not by force, but by resonance. A vote wasn't cast, it was felt. The fracturing had stopped. Not because of fear, because of choice. And the mirror began to unfold. It didn't break apart. It blossomed. Petals of dimension spiraled outward like blooming alloy fractals, revealing something within. Not an engine, not a throne, a place. It was shaped like a room, but it had no walls. It was shaped like a mind, but had no edges. Inside it stood a single figure. Not alien, not mechanical, human, or at least close. Its eyes were empty, but not hollow. Reflective, like the surface of the sea before a storm. And it spoke, audibly, across the galaxy. One word. Ready. At that moment, a new structure rose from Earth's oceans. From beneath the Pacific Rift, beyond where any mapping drones had reached, a platform ascended. Its material couldn't be identified. Its shape was unstable, shifting with every thought pointed at it. But it had a door, and no lock. Kor stepped from the ship of memory and appeared on the platform, her form unchanged but new. She turned to the sky and smiled, because humanity hadn't passed the test. They had understood it, and that was enough. The mirror closed, not to deny, to wait, until the next species was ready to see themselves. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the voice of the galaxy didn't speak through violence, conquest, or silence. It spoke through echo, and it sounded human. The galactic stage was shifting. No fleets moved, no weapons fired. And yet, across thousands of systems, civilizations paused. Not because of a declaration of war, but because they felt it. A new vector of gravity that wasn't gravitational. A pull not on matter, but on meaning. Something had changed in the human presence, something foundational. And those who watched from the dark corners of the stars now turned their gaze inward. Because the impossible had happened. Humanity had harmonized. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to ripple. Enough to resonate. And in a galaxy long ruled by ancient empires and timeless machines, the echo of coherence was more powerful than any superweapon. The Accord disbanded. Not in collapse, but in evolution. It had never been intended to carry the weight of species-level emergence. The systems that once governed borders, trade, and military action were no longer relevant in a civilization that had internal consensus. In their place rose something new. No name, no symbol, only an intent. To remember together. Humans no longer required centralized control, not because they rejected it, but because they had outgrown it. They were still individuals, still imperfect, but now they listened to one another, and more importantly, to the universe. Because now, the universe was listening back. From the outer systems, alien diplomats arrived in quiet waves. Not ambassadors, not spies. Witnesses. Some had feared Terran expansion. Others had seen them as potential allies. Now, they came with a different intent. To ask how. Not how they had built the mirror. Not how they had survived the tests. But how they had become ready. And the answer was never technological. It was discipline of self. Not control. Clarity. The willingness to face who they were, not who they pretended to be. To stare into the mirror and not look away. In the former ruins of Targinius 4, grass now grew again. Real grass. Not seeded by drones, but spontaneously returned. Its color richer. Its chlorophyll frequency aligned to the same tonal key first recorded during the mirror's activation. Some said it was just biology. Others knew better. There, on the site where the sky first cracked, a monument stood. No writing. No flag. Just a sculpture. A mirror, cracked down the center, with a flower growing through it. Visitors came in silence. They touched the surface. And they remembered. Aline Kaur walked the edge of a world no longer labeled. The black platform beneath her feet shimmered with dormant potential. It no longer pulsed with urgency. It rested, awaiting the next question. She stood not as a soldier, nor as a leader, but as a keeper. The keeper of the first threshold crossed. Beside her, a new generation of Terrans studied the stars not with maps or engines, but with stories. They didn't ask how to conquer. They asked how to listen better next time. And their teachers? Not generals, not scientists, but dreamers. Because the dream had proven to be the most resilient code of all. It could be rewritten, reawakened, shared. Dreams had led them to coherence. Dreams had made them ready. Far beyond the stars, something ancient stirred. It had watched countless civilizations rise and fall. Watched empires ascend on fire and fall into silence. But now, for the first time, something new had emerged. Not a conqueror. Not a supplicant. Not a rebel. A mirror that looked back. And the ancient presence did not retreat. It bowed. Because it had waited eons for a mind that could complete the equation. And now, the math worked. One final signal emerged from the edge of the void. Not directed. Not encoded. Just released. A line of Terran speech, translated not in words, but in certainty. We are still becoming. And across the stars, others began to stir. Not to fight, but to follow. Because when the first to pass the test holds the door open, others walk through. The stars were no longer silent. Not in sound, but in invitation. Across forgotten systems and abandoned ruins, ancient machines flickered back to life, not as threats, but as beacons. Structures once deemed inert by Terran scientists now responded to human proximity with sequences of light and low-frequency resonance, like long-dormant instruments recognizing the return of a familiar tune. The galaxy had not been empty. It had been waiting. Waiting for someone to solve the question not of technology, but of self. And now, humanity had become the first answer, but not the last. In the shadow of the mirror, still pulsing in low orbit above Calyx Theta, a second construct began to form. Not by machinery. Not by hand. By consensus. It wasn't built. It was willed. Thought, unified and coherent, had become an architectural force. Quantum-anchored resonance fields condensed into latticework scaffolding. Matter assembled where purpose aligned. The structure that emerged was not a station, not a ship, not a weapon. It was a library. Not of books or data. Of perspectives. Anyone who entered brought their story. Their memory. Their pain, their triumph, their fear. The building translated it not into language, but into pattern. And those patterns became readable by all others who entered. It was called the Weave. Not by decision, by recognition. And it changed everything. Aliens who had once waged war on humanity now came to learn. Races who had never shared a memory now shared dreams. The Weave allowed no lies, no deception, no editing. What you carried, it showed. What you sought, it highlighted. What you feared, it asked you to face. And within a cycle, new coalitions formed. Not governments. Understandings. Treaties were replaced by transparencies. Species with no shared biology found resonance. Differences remained, culture, instinct, identity, but no longer did they fracture. They enriched. Because the Weave wasn't about unifying into sameness. It was about harmony through contrast. And at its center, always, was humanity. Not as rulers. Not as saints. As the ones who had dared to look inward first. Aline Kaur no longer wore her marshal's badge. She didn't need it. Her voice, now braided into the Weave's core, carried across space to wherever it was asked for. She was not command. She was context. When new species made contact, they didn't send invoice. They sent questions. And Kaur answered with her story. Not edited. Not elevated. Just true. And that was enough. Earth changed. Its sky shimmered faintly now, touched by microresonance fields that harmonized with the Weave. Rain carried memory. Oceans whispered back. The moon grew brighter, not physically, but symbolically, as its ancient silence now reflected a deeper listening. Children were not taught facts. They were taught presence. History was no longer taught in dates, but in perspectives. You didn't memorize the wars. You walked them. Not in simulation. In understanding. And understanding, once born, could not be unlearned. One day, without warning, the mirror closed. No sound. No flare. Just a quiet folding of light, like a curtain drawn after the last act of a great play. It did not leave. It simply became unnecessary. Because what had been outside was now within. Humanity no longer needed a test. They had become the proving ground. Others would come, and they would not be judged. They would be welcomed. The mirror's final message arrived as a burst of feeling, carried across the substrate of memory, embedded into the pulse of the weave. You are no longer becoming. You simply are. And that is enough. Somewhere in deep space, on the edge of an unnamed system, a child was born to a race that had never left its homeworld. On the day she first looked at the stars, she heard something. A tone. Faint. Beautiful. A resonance that settled into her bones. She would spend her life trying to find its source. And one day, she would. And when she did, a door would open. Because the humans had never closed it. They had only said, "Come in. You're ready now."